Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation. Today I'll be talking about reinforcement and punishment. So reinforcement. Reinforcement was one of the first basic principles that was investigated for a behavior modification process. Reinforcement is defined as a certain behavior that is strengthened and increased by the immediate consequence that follows that certain behavior. One of the earliest demonstrations of this principle was done by Edward Thorndike in 1911. In 1911, Thorndike put a hungry cat inside of a cage with a can of food that was right outside of the cage where the cat could visibly see it. He manipulated the cage to where the cat could only get out of the cage by hitting a lever that was inside of it. Thorndike waited for the cat, who eventually accidentally hit the lever and got access to the food. When he placed the cat back in the box, it took the cat less time to identify the lever would grant him access to the food. Eventually, every time the cat was placed in the box, it would immediately hit the lever to get the food. Thorndike later referred to this concept as the law of effect. In the late 1930s, psychologist and behaviorist B.F. Skinner took Thorndike's study and conducted many studies using the same law of effect but using laboratory rats and pigeons as his participants. He would place one of these laboratory animals and place them inside of a cage that had a lever located on one of the sides. As soon as the animal hit the lever, a pellet of food was delivered to that animal. Once the animal received the consequence of the food, the behavior of hitting the lever increased in the future because its immediate consequence of food, which was known as reinforcement. There are many day-to-day actions in our surrounding environment that occur naturally that serve as reinforcement. There are three key things to consider for something to be reinforcement. The first is that there has to be an occurrence of a certain type of behavior. After that behavior, there is a certain consequence, and that consequence results in strengthening the occurrence of that behavior. Now, there are two main types of behavior. There's operant behavior and respondent behavior. When we're talking about reinforcement, the type of behavior that we're talking about is operant behavior. What is operant behavior? Operant behavior is defined as a certain behavior that is controlled by the effects of the consequences that follow that behavior. A certain consequence that strengthens the behavior is defined as the reinforcer. Here are some examples of some natural reinforcement that we see every day that we don't really think about being a reinforcer. So first, a child cries when he is denied a toy in the store, and the mother gives in to stop him from crying. So in the future, the child will cry in the toy aisle. The child cries in the car because the music is too loud, so mom turns down the music, and then in the future, the child will cry when the music is too loud. Leaving the house for work, and I notice that it's raining, so I'll grab an umbrella to avoid getting wet. In the future, when it's raining, I'll grab an umbrella before I leave so I don't get wet. Waking up at 6 a.m. every morning to go to work 5 days a week. I receive a paycheck, and in the future, I will continue to go to work to get money. Now, there are two types of reinforcement. There's first positive reinforcement and also negative reinforcement. We're first going to focus on negative reinforcement, and then we'll see some examples of this later. So, there are three main components when defining positive reinforcement. The first is a certain behavior occurs. The second is the consequence that follows that behavior results in the addition of a certain stimulus. And then in the future, the behavior increases. So a positive reinforcer is usually something that is pleasant, valuable, or desirable to the individual. Negative reinforcement. Just like positive reinforcement, there are also three main components of negative reinforcement. The first is a certain behavior occurs. The second is the consequence that is the result of the removal of an adversive stimulus or a decrease of the intensity of a certain stimulus. And then in the future, the behavior increases. So an adversive stimulus is something that is removed or avoided after a certain behavior occurs in this situation. This is usually something that is annoying, it's unpleasant, undesirable, or could be something that is painful. Negative reinforcement can be seen to someone as punishment because you hear the word negative, and nowadays people correlate the word negative with bad. So even though it is negative, it's not punishment because in the future the behavior increases. So even though there is the adversive stimulus, it still increases a certain behavior in the future. So what are the differences and what are the similarities? They're both similar in the sense that in the future, they both increase the behavior, which classifies them both as a reinforcer. So they both increase the future behavior of that one behavior. They're also different because positive reinforcement is the addition to a positive stimulus, where negative reinforcement is the removal of the adversive stimulus. And that's really the main difference, that consequence part. So when you're thinking about which one's negative reinforcement and which one's positive reinforcement, you want to look at the consequences, because if it's a removal of something and the behavior increases, it's going to be negative reinforcement. If it's something added and the future behavior increases, then it's positive reinforcement. So here are some examples. If Johnny does all his chores before Friday night, his mother will give him $10. In the future, the child is more likely to do his chores each week. If Joey picks up all his toys before dinner, Dad will give him his favorite candy. Joey is more likely to pick up his toys before dinner. Jenny washes her dishes right after she eats to avoid hearing her mom yell at her. In the future, she is more likely to do the dishes as soon as she is done with them to avoid her mother from yelling. When Julie gets in the car and starts driving, she puts on her seatbelt to avoid hearing the beeping sound. In the future, she will wear her seatbelt to avoid hearing the loud beeping. So these first two examples about Johnny and Joey, those are positive reinforcement because there is an addition and the behavior increases. So for the first one, it's positive because his mom will give him $10 if he does his chores. So she's adding the $10 and he's more likely to do his chores. The second two are negative reinforcement. So for the first one, Jenny washes her dishes to avoid hearing her mom yelling. So her mom yelling would be that adversive stimulus. So in the future, she's more likely to do her dishes to get out of hearing her mom yell. There's another thing that we need to focus about when talking about reinforcement. It's motivating operations. And there's two different types of motivating operations that can affect the value of a reinforcer. The first is an EO, which is also an establishing operation. So this operation makes the value of the reinforcer higher, which makes the behavior more likely to occur. And then there's AO, which is the abolishing operation, which makes the reinforcer less desirable and the behavior less likely to occur. So along with those two motivating operations, these two definitions also tie into those very closely. So first we see deprivation. Well, deprivation is an example of an EO, or an establishing operation, which increases the value of the reinforcer. So we usually see this with food or water. So if the child is working for food and just ate a big meal, they are less likely to engage in a certain behavior that you are looking for if their reinforcement is food because they're full. So, but if they didn't have food and they are working for food, their motivation is higher to get that food, so they'll engage in the behavior more often, which is deprivation. Now, satiation is an example of an abolishing operation, which decreases the value of the reinforcer. So, which I said previously, that if they had just ate a big meal and they're working for food, they're less likely to engage in that behavior to receive the food because they're already full. So they're satiated off of that certain reinforcer. Or it can also be they're satiated off an iPad. If they work for an iPad and they work for it every single time and maybe the game's starting to get boring for them, they're less likely to work for it if they're too satiated, if they've had it too much. Now, there are different types of schedules of reinforcement. So, schedules of reinforcement specify when the reinforcer is going to be delivered to the individual, if it will be delivered for every occurrence of behavior or just certain behaviors that you're looking for. There are 4 main schedules. There's fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval, which we'll get into. So fixed ratio, the reinforcer is delivered after a set amount of correct responses. For example, if the child is on a FR, or fixed ratio 3, they will have to answer 3 questions correctly or engage in a target behavior 3 times correctly, and then they would receive the reinforcer. So instead of reinforcing every occurrence, you're enforcing every 3 occurrences. Variable ratio is when the delivery of the reinforcer is determined upon an average number of responses. So if the child is on a VR, variable ratio 4, then on average a child would receive the reinforcer for on average of 4 responses answered correctly, or the appropriate behavior occurs on an average of 4 times. Fixed interval is when the reinforcement is delivered upon the first correct response after a set amount of time. For example, if the kids are on a fixed interval 15-minute, and the kids are at lunch and they have to stay at the table for at least 15 minutes before they can raise their hand to be excused, the child that raises their hand after 15 minutes have elapsed and asks to be excused will be reinforced of being excused. Variable interval. This refers to a reinforcement that will be delivered after an average amount of a set time has elapsed. For example, if the child is on a VI 20 seconds, then they would receive reinforcement on average of 20 seconds if they are engaging in an appropriate behavior. Now, on the flip side of reinforcement, we have punishment. Punishment is a behavior reduction process that is used to decrease the amount of occurrences of a behavior. So just like reinforcement, there are also 3 main components of punishment. A certain behavior occurs, a consequence immediately follows that behavior, and the consequence decreases the future of the behavior. So unlike reinforcement, punishment, the consequence for punishment is that it decreases a certain behavior, where reinforcement increases. So common examples that you see. Evan was playing in the house with his little sister. His little sister took his toy, so he hit her. His mother took away all his toys for the rest of the day. So in the future, Evan will not hit his sister. So the behavior of him hitting his sister resulting in the mother taking away his toys and decreasing his future behavior of hitting his sister. So Brett plays baseball and he didn't like a call an umpire made. So he started yelling at the umpire and eventually got ejected from the game. In the future, Brett will not yell at the umpire because he wants to stay in the game. So just like reinforcement, there's also positive and negative punishment. So first, positive punishment is when a certain behavior occurs, something adversive is added, and the behavior is still likely to decrease in the future. So although there is a word positive in there, it still decreases the future behavior. There's just something added, which makes it positive. So some examples of these. Johnny makes an inappropriate joke about another kid in the class. The teacher reprimands him in front of all his classmates. In the future, Johnny will not make jokes about his classmates. So Johnny engaged in the behavior of making an inappropriate joke. The teacher reprimanded him. And in the future, he will not make jokes. Jake's mom is making his macaroni and cheese for lunch. He gets overly excited and touches the hot burner and burns his finger. In the future, Jake will not touch the burner when it's hot. Negative punishment. So there's 3 components, just like all the others. A behavior occurs, then the consequence of that behavior is there is a removal of a positive or reinforcing stimulus, and the behavior is less likely to occur in the future. So this can also be confused with reinforcement because you hear there's the positive reinforcing stimulus that's in the situation, but that is the removal of something pleasant, which makes the behavior decrease in the future. So some common examples of this. Gabe's in class and they're in a group activity with all the students, and and Gabe kicks one of his friends. So while other kids go outside, Gabe has to sit in the room all by himself. So in the future, Gabe will not kick other kids. Another example is Connor yells at his mom when she is asked him to do the dishes. Connor's mom yells at him in front of his friends, which for all of us we know can become kind of embarrassing. So in the future, Connor will not yell at his mom. So even though punishment is a way to modify behavior, there are a lot of ethical concerns that come with punishment. Because when you hear the word punishment, you automatically think it's painful or it's bad. Or you think of the belt, or you think of timeout or spankings. But that's not what we do. So there is ethical guidelines that BCBAs have to follow in order to implement a punishment procedure, and there are many issues that need to be considered before using this behavior modification procedure, and reinforcement is always the first behavior modification that should be implemented before you go to punishment. So let's learn about some current studies. So in 2015, Kribich and his colleagues taught a child with autism to request breaks while increasing on-task engagement. So in the study, the researcher determined that the child's problem behavior and off-task behavior was maintained by escape. So they implemented an intervention in where the child was taught how to appropriately ask for breaks. So if the child is appropriately asked for a break, he's going to receive the reinforcement of getting that break, which will no longer have him engage in the off-task behavior and the problem behavior to escape from the work, is what they were hoping for. And as you can see in this graph, you see a gradual increasing trend, which is an awesome thing, because you see on the y-axis, these are, it kind of got cut off, but these are the appropriately requested times for a break. So for both different tasks, you see a steady gradual increase, which is awesome. So if he would ask for the break, that's when he would receive reinforcement of getting the break, which would give him a little time to escape from the work, and then he would come back to the work. So this study was a positive thing and worked out in the way they wanted. Another study written by Shaw and Sims in 2009 used differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior and positive punishment to reduce attention-maintained behavior. So they conducted a functional analysis to determine the function of 4 different kids with disabilities, their problem behavior. Once they determined the function for each participant, they implemented a DRL procedure and a positive punishment procedure to decrease the behaviors. If the participant was not engaging in the problem behavior during certain tasks, they would receive a token. If they were, their token was removed. And here you can see on this graph, so this is an example of Rocky, which is one of their participants, and his problem behavior was screaming. So at first, you see he had a ton of screams, like on average of 35 screams, which you can see on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis is the sessions that they implemented, and you see the different reinforcement schedules they use between the phase lines. And you'll see a gradual decrease, which is awesome, and so he decreased the frequency of his screams. And these are my references, and that was it for my presentation. I hope y'all enjoyed, and thank you.